Welcome to ZUMBI, a monthly conversation with artists, activists, and scholars whose work is influenced by the richness of Black life in Austin and around the world. Your host is writer and community curator, Stephanie L. Lane.
All right. Good morning, KAZI listeners. Again, this is ZUMBI, the interview show named in honor of Afro-Brazilian freedom fighter, ZUMBI dos Palmares. And as always, I am your host, Stephanie Lane. And making it happen time and time again, behind the scenes, is our producer and engineer, and sometimes co-host, DJ Slice. And normally, we'll talk a little bit in the beginning about today's guest, but he is with us, but we won't be able to hear his voice today. However, we were talking earlier this morning about today's show, which is all about preserving the legacy of freedmen's towns, also known as freedmen colonies and enclaves and settlements and, neighborhoods, historical Black neighborhoods around really this country. And so I was talking to him a little bit about that. And I was like, well, tell me about your family, where your family's from. And he shared that they were from Waco and Lubbock. And then he mentioned a town I had never heard of, Mount Calm. So I looked it up, and being this preservation nerd I am, I went deep into all this fascinating history about Mount Calm, and we just talked about how important it is to know about all these communities, and then the roles that communities of color, African American communities, Latinx communities, Asian communities played in this. So, and from that, it reminded me of how important this work is and how important it is to learn about who you are and where you came from. So, without further ado, we're going to jump into this. I'm really excited. Anyone that knows me, this is really up my alley and work that I'm also really committed to and honored to have with us today, Tanya Debose, who is an activist, organizer, and advocate for preserving African American history and culture. Tanya, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Stephanie, for allowing me to get on today. Good morning, everyone.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to tell the folks a little bit about you.
Okay.
So, Debose is most known for her work in the Independence Heights area, where she has deep roots, as her great-grandfather was one of the first pioneers to purchase land in what was to become the first African-American municipality in Texas. Based on her experience, Debose founded the Preserving Communities of Color initiative that focuses on preserving historic communities of color by transforming them into inclusive communities and cultural destinations. The initiative consists of an annual conference and gathering of community advocates, leaders, scholars, and elected officials. Additionally, the initiative provides support to historic communities of color, connecting them with resources, tools, and other support. She now participates in several national initiatives, most notably the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance, where she spearheads many media and engagement campaigns aimed at building awareness about historic Black towns. More recently, Debose coordinated a national summit focused on building a national heritage corridor across multiple states. This corridor is intended to connect leaders across state lines and build awareness about the importance of all Black towns and how they were created after the Civil War during the aftermath of racial unrest. Her recent work is strategically focused on organizing Texas. Through her efforts, she is creating a statewide consortium of heritage councils to serve as a catalyst for promoting the protection of African American history and culture. She is an American Leadership Forum Fellow and has received many awards and recognitions for her work in the community. She is also a mother of two and resides in Houston, Texas. So yes, again, really excited to have you on. We'll talk a little bit about our connection, which mentioned in your bio was you spearheading the Travis County Heritage, soon to be commission, that myself and other folks in the community are council members on. So yes, doing a lot of great work there.
Thank you.
Yes. So to start off, let's define these freedom towns. There's many names, right? Freedmen towns, freedom colonies. There's also enclaves, there's settlements. Can you give us a kind of a working definition for folks that may not be familiar with what they mean, a little bit of that history?
Sure. So we know that the word freedom colonies really became this buzzword when the book Freedom Colonies, kind of the independent Black Texans in the time of Jim Crow, when that book came out. And then there was work by Dr. Andrea Roberts and some others who really put freedom colonies, on the map. And so my understanding and my definition, the way I go by, is that these freedom colonies or freedom settlements are places where formerly enslaved people were able to settle, set up a place where they created homes, churches, schools, and all of that. Sometimes being a member of the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance, one of the things that happened in many of these places that started off as freedom colonies were that some of these leaders and people in these settlements did go in and they actually incorporated and established cities and towns and villages. And so what you then have is these incorporated places, and many of them still exist today. And not many of us knew about them. And so for me, that definition really is, a place where those who were formerly enslaved actually set up shop, created homes, and they lived in these places. One of the things I do want to share, as you talked in the intro, my family settled in a place called Independence Heights, which we know as the first Black city in the state of Texas. I don't necessarily consider Independence Heights a freedom colony. Okay. And one of the reasons for that is that was not the first place that my family settled. When after the Civil War and after emancipation, my family settled in Wharton County, right across the street from the plantation. And then as opportunities for African Americans began to come about, they then moved into the Fort Bend and subsequently the Houston Freedmantown area. So when we talk about a settlement, Independence Heights was not our first settlement. Independence Heights was a planned community where people could actually buy, African Americans could actually buy and own land. So our definition is a little different of how we see ourselves in Independence Heights. So I hope that helped.
It did help, and I think that's a really good point to be made. That is something that I've been talking about with folks. There are areas in Austin that's connected to my work that we really are looking at the freedom colonies, but then there are other communities that are, as old or almost as old that would not necessarily be considered freedom colonies, right? Or enclaves or settlements. So I do think that's important distinction to make, and we all kind of have this different definition of what defines that, but I think that's really a great point. So let's get into talking more about Independence Heights. So I know that a lot of your work kind of started there, but what was your journey to this work and to around preservation and history?
Sure. So this is a loaded question, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. So I did not necessarily grow up in the community of Independence Heights other than attending church and visiting with cousins in the area. So being in that community, being in that space, I'm remembering things just like anybody else would about, being a little girl, walking up and down the street, seeing these stores, seeing all these churches, the funeral home, these kind of businesses along a Main Street corridor. And it wasn't until I was about 40 years old and I started to do work with my church in the community, because that really is what brought me back to the community every Saturday and Sunday, was because we still, my family still attended church. As stated before, my great-grandfather bought land there in 1924 along the 30th Street corridor. And then as my family grew, we joined the church, and that's where I remember my start and my memory of being in Independence Heights. The journey for my work really surrounded the church and my pastor's vision for revitalizing the community. And as we started to work in revitalizing the community, one thing that became crystal clear to me was the fact that this community was very historic. The buildings that were boarded up, that people passed by and thought were blight or an eyesore, were really historic buildings that were our old city hall. They were the first principal's home. They were the last mayor's home. They were the first daycare or the first school in the community. And so it became incredibly important to try to save these places in the midst of our revitalization. And so my work started to really focus in on how do we honor the ancestors and what happened here. Nobody told us in any history book, in any school, and not even in the church, not even in my family, that this place was so critically important to the fabric of the United States as the first Black city in the state of Texas. What I then learned after that, Stephanie, was that, you know, the city of Houston, if anybody's ever been there, Loop 610 was really the boundary of the city of Houston, the northern boundary of the city of Houston. And as the city started to become more segregated, a lot of African Americans were living in 3rd Ward and 4th Ward. Many owned, but some rented. Independence Heights offered this opportunity for African Americans to own land, which is why I suspect my great-grandfather came there. Mm-hmm. And as more than 600 families made that place home, they then looked at the city of Houston, which to some extent for my grandfather, great-grandfather, was right across the street because he could look at 29th Street and see the city of Houston. And they had running water, indoor plumbing, paved streets. And so the people of Independence Heights wanted the same thing. And when they went to the city of Houston to try to get that amenity for themselves and connect to their water lines, they were not successful. And so what the ancestors did was went and found out how they could become, you know, rulers of their own destiny by starting their own city. And thereby in 1915, they incorporated and became that first Black city. And when I learned all of that, when I learned what they went through in the Jim Crow South, during a time not so long after emancipation to establish their own city, it became incredibly important to save that place. And so my pastor and other pastors in the community and then other community activists, we got together, formed an alliance, and started to try to protect and save what was left there. And so I've been on that journey ever since.
Wow. What a journey. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. I can get all caught up in this. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Support for KAZI is provided by Shepherd's Carpet Cleaning.
Shepherd's Carpet Cleaning cleans residential and commercial carpets. They inspect your carpet to determine your needs and will move furniture and return it after they clean. They also clean tile and grout, upholstery, and dryer vents. Shepherd's is fully insured and bonded, and they use biodegradable carpet cleaning products. For more information, 512-317-4846 or shepherdscarpetcare.com.
Support for KAZI is provided by the City of Austin Cultural Arts Division.
The City of Austin Cultural Arts Division, including art in public places, cultural funding, and the African American Cultural Heritage Facility, whose cultural art programs provide leadership for the economic development of the Austin's creative economy. Learn more at austincreate.gov.
Hello, Austin. This is Nelson Linder. Join me each Tuesday on a wake-up call as we discuss solutions to various problems confronting us in this community. What we call the empowerment mode is simply a concept designed to empower you and I as we address problems that really affect our entire lives. That's each Tuesday at 7 a.m., the wake-up call.
Hey, what's shaking, y'all? This is Noel Gordine. I want you to check out Ingrid After Dark every Friday morning, midnight to 5 a.m. on KAZI 88.7 and on the web at KAZIFM.org.
At home, in your car,
into the national.
KAZIFM.org. We are the voice of Austin. 88.7 FM.
Independence Heights, and we were in the middle of revitalizing. I then had to figure out how to but also make this place a culturally important place and a destination for people to come and learn our history. Perfect. And that's where Preserving Community of Color got born.
Absolutely. And we're back. So you see, we were talking during the break. We were getting into the conversation, and we're back. So before the break, we were talking about, your journey to the work with Independence Heights. And one of the things, there were many things you mentioned that resonated with me, but one of them in particular was thinking about how, you would go back to this community for church and other things. And that's what I found, even locally in Austin. It's like people who are from these communities, descendants from these communities. But a lot of times these are predominantly white communities now, but there would be this Black church there. And that's when folks would come back. And, that's often kind of been the way that we've identified some of these places because of that. Like, oh, this is interesting. There's this Black church in, South Congress. There's this Black church, off Palmer in this predominantly white neighborhood. So, yeah, that's definitely seems to be something that's a common thread. Okay, so in thinking about that, we've just talked about moving. So think about Independent Heights, that work, and then how has that kind of led to the current work that you're doing?
Sure. So as stated earlier about Independence Heights and the importance of preserving it in the midst of revitalizing, displacement of the current people became something that was concerning for us. But also, how do we share this history with people who don't know about it? Because even people in Houston didn't know about it. And so it became kind of our goal to mesh those two together. And one of the things that happened along the way of us doing the work at Independence Heights was, many of you may know Everett Fly. He actually introduced me to Mayor Johnny Ford of Tuskegee, Alabama, and the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance. And through that work, I learned about other first Black towns in other states like Mount Bonneville in Mississippi, Grambling in Louisiana, Eatonville in Florida. And we never knew about each other. And if you Google any of those, you'll find out that everybody's claiming we're the first Black city in the nation. But we all were founded around the same time. I think Independence Heights was just a little bit later. And so with that work, and working with the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance, and then having to come back to a community like Independence Heights, it gave me a clear picture that, like you just said, many of these communities still exist, but if you don't know, then you'll just drive past and see this Black church in the middle of, a white community. And you don't understand the landscape or the physical space and what was actually there. And so one of the things that became important was, how do we preserve these places? How is it that it won't just be a marker down the road that says, here lies the first, Black Masonic Lodge in, Clarksville or what have you. We need more than markers. If the physical space still exists, then why not try to preserve that? Why not try to create an environment where people can actually visit this place, learn about the history, and experience the culture of that place. And that is where Preserving Communities of Color was born.
Wow. Yes. So it's just such an important work, because you're also not just talking about, like you said, just putting, not that this is not important, but having the historic marker, how you can work to, maintain the places that are still there and are still fighting to continue on. So such important work. So we are having to make sure we wrap up at 10, which is always a challenge for me. So let's continue this beautiful transition into the specific work around the different targeting Texas right now, and the different the work you're doing with each county in preserving this history.
Sure. So at the with the work that we're doing within our own communities, and then tying that work to a national level of historic Black towns, one of the strategic plans that we have as an organization at the national level was to create this corridor of important historic Black towns and settlements. And so last year, we led, and not last year, actually it was this year in 2020, we held I spearheaded a national summit in Edenville, Florida during the Zora Fest to bring together mostly southern states to talk about how do we create this national corridor. And so we had about 14 states that came. There were 21 who are now working together to really organize within each of our states, these towns and this corridor that would run through each state.
Yeah. Hello?
Actually came back and we decided to organize Texas. And so organizing Texas was really about looking at Texas in, counties. And so we started in Harris County, and we looked at all the historic areas that were significantly African American, how some of them had disappeared, were still disappearing, and what could we do to really put together a plan and inventory of those places and a plan how to preserve those. So it would become African American preservation plan for that county. And so we started with Harris County. We were successful in establishing a council first, and then a cultural commission was established by the county commission here. And now our work really centers around, inventorying this whole entire Harris County, and then orienting a countywide plan. And even if we found Stephanie Earth, that plan will be a guide that will serve the future of these resources, these cultural assets, cultural and historical assets as resources that really are used to interpret and educate people about African American contributions in the county. And that can replicate it across other counties, including, as you mentioned, Travis and some other counties we're working in. Our end goal is to really have a state commission. So we've been talking about, how do we get organize these counties across Texas? How do we come together to really talk about who's protecting our history? How do our children find a road back to who they are so that they won't be 40 just learning about Independence Heights like I did? How do they move forward knowing and being empowered with the history of what their ancestors contributed, what they did, out in a time when we have everything at our fingertips that they can do so much more. And so that's really what the work in organizing is. And I'm hoping that we can, garner more support in other counties and move the agenda forward.
Yes, definitely. I know at this age in my life, still finding out about these communities, communities that I didn't know existed, places I was in growing up in Austin where I felt unwelcome and felt, I was like the only brown face at events and things. And if I had known, the history of these spaces, that would have just changed so much for me. So there's this beauty, in learning this history, but it's a frustration that at this point, we're still now discovering this. So that's why, this work that you're doing is so important. And we, are going to have to leave. But before we do, will you tell us how people can learn more about all of the work you're doing? Is there a way that they can kind of follow that or contact you?
Sure. So again, before I share all that, Stephanie, I just want to say thank you. This conversation should be an ongoing series.
Yeah.
And because there are so many places that have just newly been discovered and people talking, and I think people need a voice, and a platform for that. So the way to keep in touch, one, I'm on Twitter and Instagram as the Disruptive Historian, so you can definitely follow me. Also, our work at the national level with the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance is www.hbtsa.org. historic Black towns and settlements. And then our work with preserving communities of color. Yay, we're in our 5th year. We will be having a virtual conference the first weekend, the first week in November, in conjunction with Prairie View A&M University. And so more information will be found on our website at Preserving Communities of Color. And our work with the state and organizing the state. The website is not necessarily up yet because we've still kind of been a little bit below the radar in our work that we were doing to really see if this could happen and we can organize, but it would be blacktexas.org.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming on, for all the work you do. Yeah, we definitely need to figure out how to have some kind of a series and continue this because there's so much to preservation and to this work.
Yes. So
again, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And look at us. We are early. Okay. So, all right. So to listeners, again, in this moment, y'all, because we just talked about this in a meeting that we all had with Tanya, there's a lot going on, obviously. So remember to be gentle with yourself.
Yes.
Definitely. And until next time, I'm Stephanie Lang. This is ZUMBI. My guest was Tanya Debose. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
You've been listening
Bye-bye.
to ZUMBI with host Stephanie L. Lang on KAZI 88.7, The Voice of Austin. ZUMBI is brought to you with support from the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for Community Engagement, 2 vibrant cultural institutions at the University of Texas at Austin. The views and opinions expressed on ZUMBI may not reflect those of KAZI or the University of Texas at Austin.